You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Chris Puchalsky and Andrew Simpson of the Philadelphia Office of Technology, Infrastructure, and Sustainability. We talk about the Philadelphia Transit Plan, regional rail improvements, transit service levels, and agency coordination. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We've shared a few of the episodes on our Monday show, but I want to make sure folks hop on over for a behind-the-scenes look at what makes cities tick. Every month, Anthony Flint interviews leading experts, policymakers, and thinkers on topics ranging from housing to climate change to infrastructure, exploring how these issues can all be traced back to land. Some of my favorite recent interviews feature leaders like Lisa Rice of the National Fair Housing Alliance discussing racism and housing policy, and Bill McKibben on decarbonization. So open up your podcatcher and add Land Matters from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Find it on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today's podcast is brought to you by our generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show. We couldn't do it without you. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month and I'll send some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month and you'll get one of our bus-only scarves with dedicated lane designs. And finally, every donation will have access to bonus features, including podcast extras that might not fit in the original cut. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Well, Chris Puchalsky and Andrew Simpson, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Great to be here, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you.
Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? We'll start with Chris and then we'll go to Andrew.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Chris Puchalsky. I'm the Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives at OTIS. That's the City of Philadelphia's Office of Transportation, Infrastructure, and Sustainability. And I've been in this position for 4.5 years. Before that, I worked at MPO in the Philadelphia region, DVRPC. And then I've got a PhD in Urban Transportation Systems Engineering from Penn. And before that, I actually spent a few years in the automotive industry. So I worked for the Ford Motor Company designing automobiles for a few years. Great experience, having mechanical engineering undergrad, but at some point got the idea in my head that, while we do need cleaner cars, we probably also need less cars in our cities, from, the various cities that I fell in love with, including Philadelphia, just thinking about them, that they would probably work better if we had less cars driving around them.
Andrew Simpson. I am the transit policy planner at OTIS. So I work for Chris and work on all things kind of transit related. I sit with our complete streets team and try to bring a transit perspective to those projects. So working on intersection redesign projects and bike lane projects, all sorts of complete streets things, bringing kind of SEPTA along and the transit perspective there. I originally am from Knoxville, Tennessee, so grew up outside of Knoxville, and then came to Philadelphia for my undergraduate degree at Penn and did urban studies there. And at that point, I kind of realized, wait, this is something that people actually do, like cities and stuff. That's awesome. So ended up going straight from undergrad into a planning degree, Penn planning and doing transportation, and then starting at the city, working in this job.
Do you all have a formative, like a transit experience or transportation experience from when you were kids?
I would say for me, it was just kind of arriving somewhere where your life was not defined by, a driver's license or kind of growing up where there really was no transit, no sidewalks, no anything of that sort. So for me, it was just kind of eye-opening that you can basically live somewhere in just a completely different way than I had ever experienced before. That kind of really just changed my perspective on everything.
I think I had three. I think it's in growing up, I grew up on a small college campus in rural Pennsylvania. And, while I didn't feel like I grew up in an urban environment, it was a place where you could walk to just about anywhere you needed to go to, which isn't exactly a transit experience like you asked, but it is an urban experience. Then when I came to Philadelphia, like taking the subway for the first time, especially the Broad Street line, is a great subway line, and it's got great cars. It's got a super fleet, and just the convenience of being able to take it from Temple University, which is where I did my undergrad, walking around downtown. And then I studied at Temple University Japan campus in Tokyo, and then the seamless mega regional mobility I found riding those trains was a real joy to me. So I think those are some of my formative transit experiences.
Is that frustrating to come back to the US from being in Tokyo and getting back on your home system and being like, I kind of, that happens to me when I get home and I have to get on BART. And I like BART, obviously, and I like Muni, but when I go to other places, I come back and I'm like, I wish we had more.
Yeah, yes, it is. This was most clear to me when I went to Tokyo in 2010 for a trip, and getting to the airport to come back home, I had this amazing seamless experience from where I was staying near Ueno. I took 3 different trains to get to the airport. It was seamless. I tagged in once, I tagged out. It's 3 separate companies, totally transparent to me. Everything worked well. It was clean. I got off, I flew into JFK and I took the air train to the A station, and it really felt like, it was like totally falling apart. It was just terrible. It's like, wow, these don't both feel like industrialized, countries. Tokyo certainly feels like it has nice infrastructure, and New York and, all American systems really struggle with state of good repair.
I've had good experiences, though, in Philadelphia. So I've flown into Philadelphia a couple of times and taken the train downtown, and I really like that experience. I think that was a good one. So I would laud you for for a good airport to downtown experience, although that's kind of a rare trip, I think, for a lot of folks that live in the region, obviously.
Yeah, I think we do have good bones, and I think this is what we tried to point out in our plan. And while it only goes every half hour, it is a really great service from the airport that takes you right downtown. So bring it back to our transit plan that we're here to talk about. There's a lot of legacy investments in Philadelphia, and I think some of it is just making them work better.
Yeah, so let's dive in. I want to learn a little bit more about Philadelphia itself and how the region works together. You all are with Otis, which is the city. There's also SEPTA, there's DVRPC. How do all those organizations kind of work together, and how does the regional transportation kind of outlook look at the moment?
I think they all work together fairly well. I think we've got the best relationship with our transit providers, and especially SEPTA, our largest one, than maybe in the entire history of the system. We've got really productive working relationships at all levels, and again with our regional partners. But I think where the outlook is, funding is a real significant challenge for us. So we've got much lower capital funding than most other systems our size, at least per capita. And so we really struggle just making the state of good repair projects work, or something like the trolley project, which is essentially a state of good repair plus modernization project. Just delivering those are a real challenge, let alone any kind of system expansion. But I think the partnerships at least are there, and they're strong.
And you all are with the city. Obviously, the city has control of the streets, but how much, impact do you all have on the transit system and SEPTA and all the stuff that goes along in the region overall?
Yeah, I think a fair amount. Our boss is one of the 2 board members from the city of Philadelphia. So the city has 2 board members. All the suburban counties each have 2 board members also. So while the representation isn't quite equitable, at least it's there, and we're able to have the conversation at the right level when we need to have it. So I think we have a fair amount of influence. I think the other thing is, good ideas have influence. So we tried to take the best ideas that we've had, and we talked to quite a few SEPTA staff quite a few times to get what we thought were the best ideas internally and put it in our plan.
So at the top level, what should we know about the Philadelphia Transit Plan?
So we did a general transportation strategy a few years ago called Connect. And while it really set the guidelines for what we wanted to do, in a 5 to 10 year period, it really didn't go in depth. And we saw what other cities had done, Seattle especially, in being able to advance the ball by having a city transit plan. And it really opened our eyes, like, oh, we don't just have to outsource our transit planning to our transit agency. Obviously, they need to be a close partner in it. But we started on this path because we saw that we needed one. Also, when we did some work with Jarrett Walker, early bus network redesign feasibility study, I'll call it, they pointed that as a need, that the city controls a significant amount of the decisions that make transit successful or not. So it's like, oh, we really do need to come to the table with ideas. And then maybe Andrew can talk about this more, but when we started doing then the background research for the plan, we found a pattern in the history of Philadelphia, is that when the city came to the table with ideas, like really great stuff has happened over the last 100 years. And when we were not leading the way, progress has not been made.
Yeah. So going back to the early, turn of the century building of the subways, that era where you had a lot of private operators that didn't have just, one large regional government agency or semi-government agency. It was kind of the city that took a lot of leadership on building out the subway infrastructure and developing the plans for that. So we kind of drew on that over 100-year history now, looking back on those projects and that leadership. And that came to fruition. They brought in kind of leaders of civil society and organizations and industry and got a lot built. And, certainly not nearly as much as they wanted to, but a lot. But all of those good bones really were built in that era. And then as we saw with, some of the gem of Philly's planning history, the Ed Bacon work of the 1960s, which was really kind of prominent comprehensive planning that was done in Philadelphia under Bacon, we saw the formation of the Center City Commuter Tunnel come up in the city's, comprehensive document that was really kind of a lauded and comprehensive plan. And, that project doesn't get built for 20 years or more. And it's a long way off, but the seeds of it really came out of that era. It was probably kind of crazy to think about uniting two competing train services at that point, but then opportunity presented itself later on, and the city took a leadership role in getting that built and actually forming it, which is one of our biggest assets we have now. It's like that's the key to that frequent regional rail service that we talk about.
Yeah, I think you're making Boston jealous. They're trying to connect their north and south stations, and that connection to Seattle is interesting too. I mean, I noticed in the report, if you were to try to build out what you all have today, you mentioned that Seattle, would have to pay $73 billion, which obviously they're not going to have at the moment. So that base is really important, it seems like, to what you all are trying to do.
Yeah, I think it was even worse than that almost. I think they're going to spend however many, 70-some billion dollars, and they'll end up with a system that's a quarter of our size.
Yeah.
So the regional reach of the transit system is truly impressive. So that's great. Where we see the need for more immediate investment, though, is in the bus system. And that's where we can actually learn something from Seattle, is how to make our bus system work better. We got about half of our riders taking the bus now, and that just hasn't been invested in. I mean, not nothing at all, but not the same kind of investments that have been made in the rail system. So we think that's the real low-hanging fruit. And that's also the most equitable policy, really, is to start, putting some investment in the bus system when you look at who rides the bus.
Yeah, that's really hard too, because some of the stuff that you all are suggesting, like bus lanes and some of the other investments, those are hard politically. Do you expect a lot of pushback from that, or is it going to be easier going forward because you have a plan? How is that investment going to be made?
Yes, we expect pushback. So a few different pieces there. We've gotten, I think, some pretty good experience, and we're learning every day about how to get complete streets and bike projects done. So the learning that has happened in the team that's called over the last 5 years about ways that projects move forward and ways that they don't, in a system that is, Philadelphia is probably in some ways a city that runs less on, here's a great idea, let's take it. It's much more on relationships and transactions. It's, every place is relational. I think Philly is just so relational, the way the politics are. And so it's hard to come in with this great best practice idea. You might expect as a planner that just, of course, everyone's going to see it, and I don't mean to be like, oh, that happens automatically other places. I know it doesn't. But I think to a larger degree, you really got to go through the slog of convincing, doing the really block by block conversation. I think Chicago is probably the city that's most similar to Philadelphia that way. But I think we've learned a lot that is going to help us get to some of these really difficult trade-offs. And I think the trade-offs are more difficult in Philadelphia. Some of our major transit streets in the city are 26 feet between the curbs. So we currently have a parking lane and two moving lanes, which don't really fit, especially when you got a 9.5-foot lane that is moving a 108-inch bus down the street, and you've got maybe a bus coming every minute at the peak. That's really hard to make work. And then when you want to take a lane away from traffic, it's even tougher. But I think we're in a decent position to go forward. And the plan really has helped. And I think the other piece is advocacy. I think we got the plan. That's one thing that we need. And it's been really well received by a bunch of people. I think the other piece that we need is the advocacy. So something that we realized a few years ago when we put it in that Connect plan that we talked about and that we talk a little bit about in the transit plans, just how important the advocacy is to moving things forward. And I think our advocacy scene, especially around transit, has really started to come together. At the beginning of this administration, call it, 6-7 years ago, the bike advocates were together, right? Which is why I think they were able to get some priorities put in place. But the transit advocates just weren't there. And we saw situations. My favorite example is when once a few years ago, we were talking about a bus stop that has illegal parking that was blocking the passengers from being able to see the bus coming down the street. And we was like, we wanted to block that off so people physically couldn't park there. And we said, how many people a day are using it? About 500 people a day using this bus stop. And, the council person who shall remain unnamed didn't want to do it. The two people illegally parking, they thought they would shout more than the 500 people a day that are using that bus. And to the extent that we're getting groups that are being able to organize and advocate for those 500 people, I think that part is starting to come together. And as we go to put these bus lanes in over the next few years, I think we'll have some community support that maybe we wouldn't have had 5 and 10 years ago.
Just to add to that, Chris, I think one of the things that I hope the plan does, and we'll see, I mean, we're just getting into these projects now and getting them rolling, but is kind of, using data and those methods that we have to, really quantify and show the utility. I think that's something that, building infrastructure for buses in Philadelphia, we have an advantage as compared to, lots of other things where we have buses that are full of people that are rolling down the street every 5 minutes, right? A lot of these projects we're focusing, and really in the plan, we really focus in on places where we have people riding now whose bus is moving too slowly. And we've got data around that. And I think with our advocates and as we go forward, we, start to assemble the stories and the personal elements of that and build narratives that I think, or hopefully will be really convincing. This isn't like an abstract, like if we build this, the buses will come. It's that the buses are there and they're full of people who need to get to work. Those people, they deserve to get there on time and get about their lives. So I think that's something I'm really hopeful for that. And we've laid the groundwork, I think, by doing this, as opposed to just kind of pulling something out of a hat and getting to it. We've really set out what our mission is and how we're going to go about it.
Yeah, and having those advocates seems like it's been really important in other cities around the country too. I mean, Miami, what they've done down there with the frequent bus network planning and stuff like that. So it seems like that's super helpful to get to that point where you're making sure that the people on the bus have a voice versus those two parked drivers. And it's really interesting to have that discussion about 500 versus 2. Here in California, we just switched over from level of service to VMT on a lot of our CEQA facilitation. And that was a hard slog to get people to talk about like the numbers of people traveling on a corridor in VMT versus that level of service number, which is, obviously it's what happens when you talk about congestion. And we were talking with Carol Martins about the sufficient accessibility and all that stuff. So I think it's all connected to try to get to where you want to go. You all have, a 192-page plan for better transit, and you've put a lot of work into it, and it's very impressive, I must say, to go through the report and see all the work that you all put into it. How much does that help the advocates? They have something to look into, probably something that you all reached out to them to ask about as well. How much does the plan, help you all push this kind of agenda forward?
It helps a lot. It helps put down our priorities on paper and give people something to point to. It gives them an opportunity, I think, to kind of advance what they're pushing for.
I hope it helps a lot. I hope that we're, worthy of our jobs and that we're experts in the field, and that I hope this is a document for people who really care about transit. But, there's a lot of ideas out there that, we spent more than a year and a half. And in some ways it was putting down ideas that have been, gestating for me for over 20 years of, being in Philadelphia and studying transit. So I hope it helps to focus on these are the best ways that we can improve transit, both today and over the next 20 years. Already we've seen a lot of quotes from advocates. So we said that the bus projects are the most immediate projects that we can do to improve things. But in terms of large infrastructure spending rail projects, it's that trolley project. Redoing all of our trolley lines, which are at the end of their useful life, is our top big infrastructure priority. And that's already gotten picked up as a talking point among a lot of our different advocacy groups.
Yeah, and just an additional there is that I think it sets a table for a conversation, which is really important for working with with advocates. And so they're not starting from a blank slate of, even if we don't agree on a detail, we've got to, put something out there that then we can have a longer term discussion on. I think that's really important. And it really, really makes those conversations, evolve in a really positive way when we're starting from, we agree on the framework here of improving transit and getting things going. And then we can really dive into the details and talk this out. And we'll learn something too, right? We're going to evolve. We certainly don't believe that everything we said is going to be perfect, right? But it's about kicking off a process.
I think the other reason why it's helped the plan, and not so much the document itself, but the thinking that we had to put into what ended up in the document is helpful, is not just saying what is our top 1 or 3 priorities, but what's not on the list and why it's not on the list. So I'll give you a tough example here is bus electrification. It's something that we support in the document. We think is important in the document. We also think for a city like Philadelphia, it's not our top bus priority. Our top bus priority is bus lanes, and probably after that, a low-income fare program. Electrification is important, but being as underfunded as we are, and the range and just the state of technological development of EV, battery electric buses today, that's important on the list, but not our top priority. And so when we come and meet with folks who, they think that's the top priority, we can come to the table and have a great exchange with them, but we have done the thought, to actually have that exchange instead of just, kind of having a knee-jerk yes or no reaction to what they're bringing to us.
Well, it's an interesting question about what the values are of the plan and what you need to get done and how many resources you have. I mean, you have so many good things in the plan. You have bus lanes, you have better fare structure, you have the bus network redesign, trolley upgrades. But the basic value is a really important part of that. And so what were the discussions like to make those decisions of whether or not to prioritize the bus electrification and move forward with those improvement projects like bus lanes?
That's a great question. I wish it happened super cleanly, but of course, there's really,
nothing's ever clean.
There's always sausage making involved
right.
in something like this. But as we made the sausage, a few things became apparent. I'll call out 3 and maybe Andrew will add on to it. I think the first thing is that we're the poorest large city in America. That has implications not only for who our residents are and what their needs are, but also what our budget situation is. We are a city and a county together, and there are many examples. San Francisco is that way. San Francisco on a per capita basis has it's like 3 to 4 times the budget that the city of Philadelphia has. That really matters, right? And what we can afford and what we can't afford. And to the degree that, transit supported or not supported by the state, federal, regional folks in terms of funding, that also really matters. So that's why in some ways we prioritize less expensive, but I think still very impactful things. And then the other 2 things I'll say, the biggest things are equity and climate. So what's going to make the biggest climate impact the quickest? We thought getting people on a bus, even if it's a diesel hybrid bus, is a huge improvement. That's the best way to make the fastest advancement in climate. And then the equity aspects of a majority minority city with 25, 26% poverty. A lot of those folks are on the bus. I think a survey we did a little while ago said that 46% of bus riders make under $25,000 a year, right? So, how are we going to give those people opportunity and access? I think it's, serving them with how they're riding today, not how, maybe they could ride if they had a few $1 billion of investment.
Is the discussion nationally a little frustrating then? Because, they're creating pots of money for certain investments, maybe even bus electrification for this new bill that they're trying to get going. Is that frustrating, kind of having those national discussions about these pots of money that might come your way, and then you're saying that, maybe that money should be spent on something else?
Well, I think we'll have to see where it comes out at. I think it was a little bit, I was taken aback initially when I saw the size of the electrical vehicle investment versus the size of the transit investment. I'm hoping that the transit investment, stays in there and stays strong. It would be great to have the federal government help in electrifying the bus fleet. That would be great. So no complaints there. But we do have this massive, backlog of repairs that we need to undertake. So when you have a $4.6 billion backlog in just your state of good repair needs in your transit systems, you really got to make sure you're trying to address those first before you're making significant improvements.
I think it was really good to see, fix it first and state of good repair kind of become important topics and something that there's interest in. Because I think also what we went through with this is that, as you're doing those things, I like to say, like, one of the important reasons why you need to do 20, 30-year planning is so that as you're fixing things and as you're making those repairs and developing that infrastructure, that you're moving towards something. So a lot of that state of good repair is also an opportunity to evolve the service and start meeting these other goals, so that we're fixing things the way we want them to be in the future and moving towards that. So I know it doesn't always sound like the best, it's not a new project or not a new line or new something like that, but it does allow us to improve service and get people actually riding. If we can increase frequency on a rail line, for example, that has state of good repair limitations, like that's a benefit to service and to ridership and meets our goals. So
to add on to what Andrew said, it's the regional rail system, I think, where this aspect of having a sense of where you want to go is really important, because they're going to be investing in that system one way or the other over the next 30 years and making sure those investments are aligned. So when the next vehicle fleet is procured, you want to make sure those vehicles service the kind of vision of where you want to go, instead of maybe some kind of in-kind replacement that could work for a different, more commuter rail focus. So that we want to have 15-minute frequencies on our regional rail lines. That has implications about the style of the vehicle, and using more metro style fleets for our regional rail service is important. So putting that stake in the ground so that not only hopefully that influence is internally at SEPTA, but when we are interacting with them, we can have a reason to ask, ready to go. I think this is the best large infrastructure proposal we've ever seen in this country. That doesn't mean that it can't get better, but this is the best one in terms of the kinds of investments that are being made.
You mentioned regional rail. That was something that caught a lot of people's attention, especially since there's so many other large cities, at least, that are trying to do similar things. How is Philadelphia's regional rail different than most cities in the United States?
I don't think Philadelphia's regional rail system is all that different than other cities. I think the one key difference is our Center City commuter tunnel. And maybe the second one would be the degree to which we have electrification on our system. All of our lines are electrified because that we have this tunnel and we have this tunnel. That means you can have through running electric service that touches 5 stations in the core of the city. So you get to a lot of different places without having to transfer. So that enables a lot of things, a lot of access. And so it means that if you would just increase the frequencies, you would have metro style service to an incredibly large catchment area for something that's maybe not feasible or is easily feasible for other American cities.
Yeah, I think that, and then the Philadelphia region grew around the railroad. We have, fairly dense suburban patterns, especially in the inner suburbs, that really, I think, over time, can continue to grow around rail service. And, but, we don't have the issue of trying to adapt a freight corridor with no land use around it to passenger service, where we've kind of got a land use mismatch and trying to get people to a different place. Most of our suburban towns grew around their train station. So I think that's also a big aspect of it, and both the suburbs and, parts of the city as well.
I think our stereotypical suburban corridor is called the main line, right? Maybe not even everybody knows on the main line why it's called the main line, but it was the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and it was, largely settled in the late 1800s. And to the extent that you've got, 100-plus-year-old transit-oriented developed just waiting for more service, I think that's the regional strength that we have.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about how you can improve that too. I mean, just because you have the tunnel, you have the ability to do that, like you said, with the electrification and everything. I think that's really exciting. Another thing that's connected to that to a certain extent is in the connectivity realm is the fare policies, right? And trying to get people to connect between the buses and the trains without some sort of a penalty. That's one thing I've been harping about that I wish I could see in the federal transportation bill or the infrastructure bill, which are two different things. Some people don't quite understand that they're going to be two different things, is that, here in San Francisco, at least in the Bay Area, we have 29 agencies. And so, making, those transfers are penalties. And then the agencies also feel a little bit like they're going to get shorted if the penalties are made less severe. So how are you all dealing with the fare transfer discussion and the fare policy implications of having a better system?
Maybe I'll start with kind of how we organize this. So we've got, fare platform and integration, which I think is really important. And that's mostly a technology and policy type issue. A lot of, accounting software, things like that have to happen. And then we've got, how much do things actually cost? And those are just to kind of break this out. That's how we started. So on the first part about integration, we really think that SeptiKey, which is our kind of smart card program that works throughout the SEPTA system, has kind of finished rolling out to regional rail over the last year, really allows you to keep a value in a virtual wallet and tap each time you ride. That's a great step forward. It's a major improvement over the past of buying tickets and having a token. And it's made SEPTA feel like one holistic system in a way that it really never has since it was founded as multiple systems mashed together. So that's a big step forward, but it's not the end product. It's not the end goal. So we really set the goalpost on an open and an equitable fare system where the instrument itself moves towards an open payment platform, allows us to integrate with the PATCO and the New Jersey transit operators as the transit operators in the region. We all kind of move towards an open platform. It allows that integration. It makes, making those transfers, whether it's from a SEPTA bus to a regional rail train, easier or doable, but also, between other providers. We have one major provider and then a few others, but we want to see that grow.
We are more fortunate that we've got, say, 95% of our ridership on a single system. It hasn't always felt like a single system, but I think the key gets us there. The other are the policy aspects, which are really difficult. We tried to walk this tightrope because we think transit agencies are actually in this tightrope condition where they've got to bring in the revenue, right? You've got to have sufficient revenue to operate equitable service, yet equitable service, you want the fares to be low as possible. That is an inherent tension. And I think that is missed by a lot of the really well-meaning advocates who want free fares for all type policies. I think that is an inequitable fare system, is free fares for all, because it doesn't bring in revenue sufficient to provide the service. I think where I'd like to see some type of federal intervention is operating support for large agencies. I think that'll help. I think the other thing is this, having a low-income fare program. You don't have to have low fares for all. There's a lot of people who that won't affect their mode choice, right? So what you need for those folks is to have a service that's really compelling, really strong, that benefit the folks who are also very price sensitive, and the folks who are very price sensitive because of their income. You provide them a low income fare program. Our water department does that. Our gas utility does that. Other transit agencies do that. So if we can figure this out, I think that's the way to get everybody on board.
Yeah, I'd love to see the feds. I know that they don't want to get into operating, but I think that's a kind of not a backdoor way in, but a way in to, backstop some of the service levels through, fare policy or through, paying for those penalties or anything like that. It seems like it'd be really helpful for larger agencies to have this kind of, connective tissue through that funding, because like you said, there's a lot of folks that are looking for free transit, but if you get rid of $200 million of your budget, like, Muni would have to do here in Bay Area, where are you going to get that $200 million? And then what if you want to the service? The better service is actually more equitable than saying everybody get on the trains and buses, but hey, we're going to have $200 million less service.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it's $400 million service. Even if you had an extra $400 million, you wouldn't want to just, put it all into free fares. I don't think that's the most equitable part.
Yeah, if you could expand the service even more, that would be even more advantageous. It's interesting to think about your access issues as well. I mean, one of the numbers that I saw in the report was the number of jobs you can reach from downtown on a regular weekday at noon versus on Sundays. So 451,000 jobs versus the 356,000 jobs. That's a huge difference. And if you can put money towards service that would get more people to more jobs on a Sunday, that's a benefit as well.
Oh yeah, just that was an analysis of a hypothetical person in the Fair Hill neighborhood in North Philly, a place with high poverty and people need access. And like you said, it was a huge difference. The ability to, you basically lose access within 45 minutes to our second largest job center in University City. So you can, maybe you can still get to and from Center City, but there are thousands and thousands of jobs just across the river that just because of frequency, that person doesn't have access to. We run the same lines on the weekend. The routes don't change, but just how often the bus comes, the train comes defines what, that person's opportunity, which is.
I'll steal a line. Frequency is freedom. I think, it's that way a lot of places, and it's that way in Philadelphia. I think one thing that Philadelphia doesn't have as much as most places is a last mile problem. There are very few places that aren't within a quarter-mile walk or less from, some kind of transit line, let alone a high-frequency transit line. So we have the access. It's just making sure it's there when people need it, especially the folks who really rely on transit. We had a survey done by some of our economic empowerment folks, and they found that transportation in Philadelphia is the number one difficulty that people have in finding or keeping a job. And a lot of those folks, they're not the briefcase folks who are going to Center City, to and from Center City at rush hour. They're the folks who are traveling on the weekends or late at night, and they're the ones who need the high frequency service that we don't have today. The service is great if you want to go into and out of downtown, at rush hour on a weekday. It's less good if you want to go other places or at other times.
That makes me think about the pandemic as well and what that means for, when we get back to not having to worry about people being close together again. And how important it is to have service to get people back to jobs, especially as we open back up again. I'm curious how the pandemic changes your thinking about this, or, how the plan actually helps maybe build back some of the economic benefits that were lost because of having to shut down and having to stay away from other folks.
So we started this plan before the pandemic, and then the pandemic happened, and I don't know about you, but I had some sky was falling kind of worries, here and there, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. And then I think once everybody took a deep breath, we realized, no, cities still matter. Cities are still real. And transit, especially in a place like Philadelphia, that is as dense of a city as you're going to find, other than perhaps, New York. Philadelphia is a European style city. It just does not work without transit. So we needed this work in order to make sure that Philadelphia not only recovers, but reimagines as it recovers. I think the pandemic really changed our thinking about regional rail. This idea that you need frequent service, 15-minute service, that the commuter rail market isn't there. You really have to think not only for your regional rail, but for all your services. How do you serve a wide variety of trips at a wide variety of times of the day?
I would just say, one of the critical things that I try to remind everyone when we talk about this is like buses aren't empty. Right? People are still out there, and the people who rely on our service the most have continued riding because they're essential to the operations of our entire society, right? So we have had just kind of ridership on commuter rail kind of fall off the cliff, but on city transit, remained a lot stronger. Certainly we have reduced ridership, and it's good. It means people are staying home and stuff. But for folks like myself or us who have the kind of privilege to sit and work at our bedrooms for a year, I think in a city like Philadelphia has a really, strong service economy, and, those jobs aren't going to work from home. People still need to get around, and that's just really important to keep in mind.
I want to think about the future a little bit here. I know that there's been a discussion about curb management a lot in cities around the country, and especially as all these companies try to pop up and make you monetize the curb and all these other things. But how important is street management going to be in the future, especially, with these coming advancements in technology, with the needs of urban places for access for pedestrians and cyclists and things that maybe the tech companies aren't thinking about because they're too busy worried about autonomous vehicles and delivery robots?
I think it's important. I think this is something that we've honestly probably struggled a little bit with, just to the degree that we're a super underfunded, transportation group. It's hard to keep this ball moving forward. We are moving it forward though. So we're involved in the Open Mobility Foundation and the curbside management. I think we need the tools that are there. So that's why we're working on proposing some automated enforcement tools that we really need, and some smart loading zone dynamic parking pricing tools that we need so that we can really manage the curb. I think that comes out of the transit work, but then interfaces really well with our freight and delivery management tasks that we're doing. It really matters. We did a project on Chestnut Street, which is, again, one of these major downtown bus corridors. It has 4 different lines. All of them are frequent, so 15 minutes or better service throughout the day. It has a bus lane that was always blocked, right? Because there's just no place for all the demand of the skyscrapers all around it for those stopping to go. What we did to improve it was create more loading zones. So that was a transit strategy. So improving the curbside use was a strategy to get people on buses to where they're going faster. But we need to do more of that. And I think we need more of the tools, both from the state and from our own legislative body, in order to use technology to manage the curb.
Do you have a favorite part of the plan, or a part that maybe people don't talk about a lot, but you're really super passionate about, or you dug in on it more than maybe you thought you were going to?
My favorite part, it's the part I spent probably the most time on. I put together the whole document, but spent a lot of time and a lot of energy in thinking about bus corridor prioritization, kind of buried in there because there's a lot of content and we took out a lot. We were debating about, do we have this in appendix? Like, does anyone want to really dive into this data technical method? So we didn't do that, but we did do a lot of work really digging into the data on buses. Just something I really love about it is we were able to really dive into a lot of bus data, both SEPTA and New Jersey Transit, and come up with some pretty cool methodology on understanding how many people are on a corridor, roughly who those people are. And we were able to quantify with some great work by a company called eConsult that they did for SEPTA. We were able to quantify the proportion of low-income riders on that corridor. And then we took it further and looked at average speeds and reliability. So we were separating out speed and reliability. So, sometimes you have a bus that is reliably slow. So we're able to kind of do some things there to really weight and prioritize these corridors. So
the map showed up though, right? The bus priority map with the green lines, right? That caught my eye. So
yes, the product is a big part of the plan. The process was buried a bit more, but
right.
I think my two favorite parts of the plan are, one is the regional rail section. Part of it's because of my academic training. There was a guy named Vukan Vucic who was my
I was going to ask about, you said Penn, and I was like, I wonder if Vukan Vucic was a part of your education.
I was, in some accounting, I was his last PhD student, and it was great to be able to take a lot of ideas that were really his ideas that he had put down on paper in 1984, and just to update and restate them and to create this new vision. And then to take it a little further and say, there was a lot of interlinking pieces. You can't just do one thing and get frequent service. You kind of got to do 4 things at once to get it, and to be able to figure out and try to describe, here's how the different pieces fit together. And if you can fit them together, there is tremendous value that gets unlocked. So that was probably my one favorite part. And the second is this idea of extending the PATCO line. That's our one subway service that goes to New Jersey and is operated by its own agency, extending it westward across the river. We've got this enormous job center, our hospital complex. We've got Penn Hospital and the Children's Hospital there, and it doesn't have great transit access. And if we can extend it across the river, not only I think do we get, people from New Jersey have better transit access, but people on the Market Frankfurt and the Broad Street line can transfer to the PATCO line and take it across. This was an idea that was proposed in the 19-teens, fell off the radar. Proposed in the 1970s, Philadelphia didn't have a great plan, and it died, I think, because we didn't have the right kind of leadership. So to be able to resurrect this idea, put it back on the table, and hopefully we'll be able to move it forward through some kind of alternatives analysis, so that not next year, but maybe the next great, amazing infrastructure package, we'll be able to fund some kind of construction activity.
I love that line or the planned line, the ... because, it's not a typical, suburb to city corridor. It connects the city with another employment center. And I think that implementation of that type of grid is actually maybe more important sometimes than making those suburban to downtown connections. And so it's a really interesting thinking about the future. And hopefully more cities are going to do that, because I think a lot of our post-pandemic thinking, who knows what's going to happen actually with downtown jobs and things like that. But if we're going to serve the community as a whole rather than just the downtown workers, there's going to be more investments like that actually connect people with those jobs and create more access.
Yeah, I think this goes to the question of metro design. And I think the best metro systems are those that look like you dropped a pile of spaghetti on a plate, right?
Yeah.
They just cross in so many different places. So when you look at Paris or London or Tokyo that we were talking about, they look like a pile of spaghetti, right? And to the degree that we've got these kind of 2 lines plus our trolley service, they just, they don't have that many crossing points. Being able to extend the PATCO line, I think, would start to get us to this pile of spaghetti where it's useful, not just going from, to one place, but to and from many places.
So what does success look like? How is that measured? What is success? Is it on a time frame of some sort? Do you have a 5, 10, 15-year frame for success? What does that look like?
I think it's Andrew gets to retire having implemented the whole plan, and I get to come to his retirement party and slap him on the back. I think that's part of it.
We have some shorter term metrics. I think we've got some different goalposts here. On the shorter term, we have some, very specific measures that we want to track and keep the pulse of, as far as ridership and accessibility to jobs and an equity focused version of that, and then access to frequent transit, as well as bus speed. So those are kind of looking at the short term that we're going to focus on. But I think the longer term is a lot harder to quantify.
Yeah, I think the short term looks like we've implemented a few of these bus-only lanes in the city that we have planned. We have a low-income fare program probably piloted in the next 3 to 5 years. In the next 3 years, we have our trolley mod program well underway. Design, if not construction, has started. I think in 10 years, it looks like we've got really thriving bus ridership that people are starting to say, we should upgrade these to some kind of heavier service. The trolleys are done, and that some of these major subway extension projects, if they're not in construction, they've at least moved through the NEPA process and they're ready to start applying for new starts or whatever the program is, 10 years from now.
Well, I feel like we could probably talk for another hour, but I want to be mindful of your time. Where can folks find the plan if they want to go and peruse it? I think actually folks should. There's a lot of really good design stuff in there. There's a lot of really good information. What's the best place to get it?
If they Google Philadelphia Transit Plan, it will be the first link.
Awesome. And where can folks find you all if you want to be found?
I'm on Twitter, but I'm not really on Twitter. You can email us both at firstname.lastname@phila.gov. And we'd be happy to talk to anybody.
My Twitter is solely focused on the Sixers.
I hope you all do well this year. My Warriors aren't so great, so.
I'm hoping that the Phillies are, good, better, not terrible this year. So.
That's a whole other podcast, Philadelphia Sports.
Oh.
Maybe there's a sports and transportation podcast.
You should start it.
Well, Chris and Andrew, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot, Jeff, for taking interest.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old daily cities news list, by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod on patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.